Welcome to The Catholic Perspective, a podcast brought to you by rcspirituality.org. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, everyone. I'm Father John Bender, and I'm here with Father John Pietropaoli. And today, we were hoping to talk about a favorite of ours, which is the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and probably I could say broader Lord of the Rings genre, all the build-up and the Hobbit and the Silmarillion and the letters and all that stuff. I know, Father John, you're a big fan of Tolkien and these, and this series, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's actually the first book that I could say I really just fell in love with. Some books just capture you. For me, this was the first one. Actually, my dad read it to us when we were kids.
Really?
Yeah, so
that's cool.
I think I was 5, my sister was 6, and he read us The Hobbit, and then he read The Lord of the Rings.
Wow.
And it took, I think, 2 or 3 years. So I actually learned how to read in the intervening period. So
wow.
I was reading ahead and catching up, but every night he would read to us. And then he did the same thing with my 2 younger brothers, and then the same thing with my youngest sister years later.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was like a family affair.
It was, yeah. Although my mom doesn't like it, actually.
Really?
Yeah, but my dad loves it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously a lot of us have read the book or the books, but it really became a hit in, the early 2000s with the movies, right? And with there had been movies before or anime movies or cartoons, but this one was really kind of just took it to another level. And really brought it all to life. Everything that we had imagined when reading the books, it kind of had now visual expression, and it became it's just it is an amazing trilogy or series. So,
yeah, a sign of that is The Return of the King won 11 Academy Awards.
Wow.
The only other movie that's ever done that is Ben-Hur.
Really?
Which is kind of, we can talk about that a little bit. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Two Christian narratives are the movies that have actually won the most Oscars. And it was nominated for 11 and it won 11.
Wow.
So obviously that speaks to Peter Jackson's genius in directing it, but also I think even more potently to the power of the story itself.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, we didn't really have any overarching theme for this podcast other than kind of just maybe just talking about all of our favorite parts, knowing that most likely this is such a rich trilogy and theme or story that down the road we'll have more podcasts kind of maybe more directed to certain themes in Lord of the Rings itself. But I was thinking just today we could just start off by sharing some of our favorite parts and what those mean and how those have kind of inspired or helped us.
Yeah, maybe if this just came to me, so it's kind of random, but maybe if I could just zoom out for a minute.
Yeah.
Because something that I've been thinking about a lot is how Jesus is the Logos. So the second person of the Blessed Trinity is the Logos. We have that word Logos. In the beginning was the Logos. And of course, as we know, that word is such a fascinating word in Greek because it means so many different things.
Yeah.
So it can mean word. In the beginning was the Word. That's the way we often translate it, and that is a totally valid translation. In the beginning was the Word. It also means truth, and it means communication, speech. It can also, and this is fascinating, it can also mean story or narrative. So in the beginning was the story or the narrative, which is so interesting because you think about how Genesis 1 begins by God speaking. God speaks order into chaos. He speaks life into non-life, being into non-being. And so I think that's a really fascinating insight because these great stories that just catch our hearts and speak to us so deeply, they're part of this great story of God, the Logos of God. Maybe that's the way we could look at metaphysics, because you and I both study philosophy. We know the importance of metaphysics, right? The study of being itself. Why is there something and not nothing? Or what's the foundation? What's the ground of all existence and all being? It's not a term that's very popular now, metaphysics, but in a certain sense, I think in today's world, at least in our Western culture, we use the word narrative in a similar way. It's kind of the ground that gives meaning,
Right.
the foundation that gives meaning, that ties different, apparently disparate elements or events together. And so these great stories like The Lord of the Rings, they're just part of this narrative of God, really.
Yeah.
And that's why they speak to us so deeply. We don't actually invent that. We just discover it. We discover this resonance with these stories. And there's a reason for that. It's because of the Logos, the great story of God himself, into which we've been called and in which we participate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, totally. And I think that that explains a lot of the power of Lord of the Rings. And I guess before we even get into some of our favorite parts of it, it's interesting, and I like this about Tolkien is, he was a professed, I don't want to say hater, that's a strong word, but he did not like allegory as a written, at least for this. He did not like allegory because allegory, in his words, allegory was what the domination of the author. So you had to interpret things as what the author intended, right? And he was trying to write something that the reader could identify with and identify differently depending on the different situations. So for him, he said, The Lord of the Rings, and this is in The Lord of the Rings, the introduction to The Lord of the Rings, he said, for me, it's not an allegory, it's a history. It's a story. And that the power is in the story of the of the book, the trilogy, and that's why people can identify, is because more. You can identify in allegories, right? If what the author is intending connects with you, but in a story, there's a history, there's backgrounds, there's developments, there's family lines, and things just you're able to identify and see yourself more in different aspects of different characters, right? There's different aspects that you identify with so many of the different characters in different moments because it reflects more of your life, and I'm quoting him. He said, "I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that may confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader and the other in the purpose domination of the author." So he really kind of wanted people to be able to resonate with the story and the power. And at the end, later on, he says, whenever you talk about a myth or anything like that, you have to use allegory, right? So in a certain way, there are aspects that are allegorical to his work, but he said it's when the story is so good and so true, then the allegory, you read the allegory as real, as a story, right? To your point. And I think that totally explains why Lord of the Rings has been such a dominant classical series for generations and different generations over, the past, what is it now? 70 years. Yeah. Yeah, maybe we could say there's something comparable with the great stories in the Bible. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I was talking to this young guy not too long ago, and he's been going through the book of Genesis. We've been talking about Genesis. And it was interesting because he really identified deeply with the story of Jacob. And he said, this seems so like real life, the family dynamics and the tensions that are there. And then the relationship between the brothers, Jacob and Esau. And then you have Isaac, whose favorite is Esau. And then you have Rebecca, whose favorite is Jacob. And then Rebecca kind of connives with Jacob to steal the birthright. Right. And then obviously Esau, doesn't like that. And Jacob leaves. And then Jacob himself gets duped by Laban. Right. And so he kind of learns what it's like to be betrayed. And then he repents and then comes back and meets Esau again. So it's just really interesting how those stories in the Old Testament, although they do have different layers of meaning, as we spoke about a couple podcasts ago, at the same time, there's something so relatable to them, in them. And I think that's the same thing that we find actually in The Lord of the Rings. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's just maybe we'll just dive in. What are some of those stories that for you in the Lord of the Rings, you know, there's the overarching story, the quest. But what are some of those? Maybe there's a favorite. You have a favorite story or a favorite storyline in Lord of the Rings?
Well, one of the things that has always impressed me is the way that the story seems to have a life of its own. Mm-hmm. Because if you read the first chapter of The Fellowship of the Ring, A Long Expected Party, the tone is, at the beginning in particular, is fairly similar to The Hobbit. It's a bit more lighthearted. You're not exactly sure, where is this going?
Yeah.
There's foreshadowing in it already, obviously, especially with Gandalf. But you're not exactly sure what turn is the story going to take. And then, of course, The Shadow of the Past and subsequent chapters, it takes a more serious turn. But I think that's so interesting, too, because it's almost as though Tolkien himself is responding to some inspiration. He's not completely in control of the story, we might say.
Oh, cool.
And so that's just an interesting way to begin that I've always found fascinating.
Yeah, that could really just take off in any direction.
Right, exactly.
And you're not really sure where, how. Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. For me, there's so many, I have so many favorite parts, you know, and it seems like, you know, it's one of those things where you have so many favorite parts, you know, that it's like the whole movie. But I love moments where the characters could have quit, where they're just overwhelming odds, obstacles, death, despair, discouragement. They don't see a way forward, and someone in the group decides to keep going and brings the others along, you know, and it starts a little bit at the beginning with the four hobbits as they're leaving the Shire. There's different moments where Merry and Pippin are like, yeah, no, we're done. We're not going anywhere. This is it. Let's go back. And Frodo's like, no, we need to get to the tavern in Bree,
right.
And meet Gandalf. And then there's moments where Sam, you know, encourages and says, no, come on, stop messing around. We need to do this. And then later, I think, you know, the council, and it's Elrond is just like, I'm not, you know, this has got to be done, but we, you know, the time we're done, you know, we're, and that whole dynamic, when there's moments, especially with Elrond, you know, when you try to get into the character and just experience what he's feeling and experiencing, you know, as a leader of the elves for thousands of years by this point, right? Or hundreds of years at least.
Yeah, thousands.
Yeah. And he's already fought Sauron with men. And you know, that line, he said, I was there the day the strength of men failed. You know, I was there. We had it. Like, we were done. This was going to be it. And it was going to throw the ring into the fire, right? Isildur. And he didn't. You know, so you can imagine the sense of betrayal, of hopelessness that Elrond felt at that moment, having sacrificed men and women from his kingdom who are more immortal, so that, you know, they can outlast anybody. So if they just hide and fortify themselves, they'll outlast anybody. And here they are, willing to fight for what is best, and die and lose their immortality and die. And so he lost men and women of his kingdom in that battle. And here he is faced again with the same evil and a new call for a new alliance, and obviously struggling with it. And he said, I was there the day the strength of men failed. No. And so for me to see how he grapples with that, and then in the end commits to helping again, right? And later in the movie, they forge the sword, and he gives it to Aragorn, which is, that whole story is another really amazing story, just the whole sword of Isildur's heir and all that, right? But that's one of my favorite parts is just seeing the dynamic that happens in those different decision moments. You know, another one is with Sam and Frodo, and this is the second book, when they're captured by Faramir and his men, and then especially the drama in the movie is amazing, where the Nazgul are coming, they're attacking, they're outside Minas Tirith in that front city, Osgiliath, right? And Frodo's about just to give the ring, just hand it over, and Sam comes and tackles them and they fall down the stairs, right? And then Frodo's on top of them with the sword. And then they fall off and Frodo's like, we shouldn't even be here. What are we doing here? We shouldn't even be here. This is too big for us. And Sam just has that monologue, which is so powerful. And, he talks about how the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered, full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the ending, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? And then he goes on to say, but now I figured it out. And he said, what really mattered was those folk in those stories had chances of turning back, only they didn't. They didn't because they were fighting for something. And I think that that's such an amazing testimony and an inspiration for our lives. Because then Frodo says, well, what are we fighting for? If we're in this big story, what are we fighting for? Yeah,
and actually I want to pause on that for a minute, because there's another line there in that same period. In the book, it's a little bit later. It's in the Path of Cirith Ungol when they're going up to where Shelob is. But what's interesting is Sam, as part of that monologue, he says, I wonder what kind of story we've fallen into, Mr. Frodo. I wonder what kind of tale we've fallen into. It's such an important question, isn't it? Because that's kind of the question.
Yeah.
Is there meaning or not?
Right.
And what you see in The Lord of the Rings, actually, what enables the characters to continue choosing what they started out to do is that there is a deep meaning.
Right.
There is an overarching meaning. And it's not discovered, it's not created, better said, by us. It's given to us.
Yeah.
And actually, if we go back to the very beginning, to the Shadow of the Past, which is where Gandalf in the Fellowship of the Ring tells Frodo what he's learned about this ring.
Right.
It is.
Right.
That it's the ring of power. It's the one ring.
It is the one, yeah.
Forged by Sauron for the domination of the world.
Yeah.
And Frodo's this, little fat, jolly hobbit person with furry feet, right? Who likes to eat 6 meals a day. Although there's some inner resolve that starts to make itself apparent. But he's about the unlikeliest hero imaginable. And so there's that moment in there where he says to Gandalf, I wish this hadn't happened in my lifetime.
Right.
I just wish, why do I have to have this burden put on me? Look at me.
Right.
Fat little Frodo. Why do I have to do this? He said, I wish it hadn't happened in my lifetime. And Gandalf says, so do I. Mm-hmm. So do all who live to see such times.
Yeah.
But he said, but that's not for us to decide. Yeah. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
That's an awesome dialogue. Yeah.
And then he says to Frodo, a little bit later, he said, but Bilbo, who discovered the ring originally in The Hobbit, in Gollum's lair, he said, Bilbo was meant to find it. Mm-hmm. And that means that you were also meant to have it. And that may offer some comfort.
Yeah.
So what kind of story have we fallen into? With a meaning, with a plan, with a providence, with a divine providence, which is impossible to understand all the time, right? Like Isaiah, where God says, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Right. But there is a divine providence. There is a love behind this, moving this.
Yeah, and even I think there's another phrase, and maybe in the same moment or a different moment, where it says Gandalf says there are other forces at work than the forces of evil.
Right.
Which is so true, and on a literary side is ingenious. That Tolkien doesn't overtly make this a Christian or God or a Catholic work, but it is very Christian and very Catholic, just because of, and he himself said it is because I'm Christian and I'm Catholic, and this is it's a story, the true story. But that phrase too, there are other forces at work, right? Just it gives hope. It gives meaning and hope to the characters in the book, like you said, but also to us.
Right. And
when we see the world around us and situations and maybe problems, and they say, well, there are other forces at work besides the forces of evil, meaning the force of good, God's providence.
Right. Because it goes back to what we talked about a couple of podcasts ago about the two narratives, how there are really only two narratives. Right. There's God's narrative, which is the true narrative, and then there's Satan's narrative, which is a warping of God's narrative. It's an attempt to constantly undermine God's narrative. And Satan's narrative is precisely the opposite of that. There is no hope.
Yeah.
The forces of evil are all powerful.
Right.
Because, Satan, he's a little despot, really. That's what he is. And he wants to be worshipped as God. So one of the ways that he tries to do that actually is through fear. It's interesting.
Right.
That's another way, actually, of giving Satan more power than he has, is by believing that evil has the last word.
Yeah.
And obviously, most of us don't do that explicitly, but implicitly, the temptation's always there.
Right.
Because we're being bombarded with evil. We're being bombarded with bad news, so to speak, constantly. It's interesting. Aragorn's name, so his elvish name was Estel, which means hope.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, and he really is a character that develops into the symbol of hope, right? I think at the beginning, his name, he's Strider, he's a ranger, he's hidden. In Bree, he's covered up, Yeah,
that's right. Even he's got the hood over his face.
The hood.
Yeah.
He's in the corner. He's watching everything, but he's not drawing attention to himself, right? And then I love the scene, and I'm talking here about the movies just because of the visual effect that it had on me. But when after the Battle of Minas Tirith, and they're contemplating what to do, and in the movie, Gimli's in the throne, sitting in the throne, and they're all standing there, and it's Gandalf that is kind of doubting, right? Gandalf's like, I can't see clearly. I don't know if he's alive. I've lost sight of Frodo. I don't know. And it's kind of like, well, what do we do? And it's Aragorn that says, we need to create a diversion. Like, we need to attack to give Frodo a chance. So he's the one that hopes that Frodo is still alive. He's the one that hopes that if we do this, we can still possibly prevail. And because it had been Gandalf the whole way for most of the time until Gandalf in Moria, right, falls. But then when he comes back, it's still him leading the charge with the different characters. And in that moment, now that Aragorn has the sword, right, now he's the true heir. He has the sword. He's in Minas Tirith, and he's the one that says, "Let's do this."
Yeah. Actually, if I could go off on a wild tangent here,
please.
Thinking about Gandalf always reminds me actually of a good spiritual director in that sense, because as a good spiritual director, what is it that we're really seeking? Well, we're seeking growth in the directee's relationship with God, which also means growing maturity, responsibility, and ability to hear and follow the voice of God.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how Gandalf does that with Aragorn.
Yeah.
How right early on, it is very much more of kind of a mentor-mentee in a certain sense with Gandalf and Aragorn. But Gandalf, and this happens in the books too, actually, how he does step back and he begins to give more and more and more responsibility to Aragorn throughout the story. And so by the end of the Return of the King, Aragorn is asking Gandalf, okay, now we've won, what should I do? And Gandalf basically says, you're ready. This is you now. This is your time now. And actually the same thing happens with the hobbits as well. When they go back to the Shire, which doesn't appear, unfortunately, in the movie. The movie would have been 12 hours long. But the scouring of the Shire, where they have to go back and clean up their homeland.
Yeah, by Sauron.
Right, and the same thing, they want Gandalf to go with them.
Right.
And Gandalf says, there are some serious problems in your Shire. And Frodo and the others say, well, how can we do this? And Gandalf says, you've grown.
Right.
You've grown. You're ready for this. Yeah. This is your time now.
Right.
And he doesn't go with them.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The four of them go back.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting there. I mean, just kind of a cool thing that you have a captain of Gondor and a captain of Rohan in Merry and Pippin, right? And they're able to go back, and then from what they learned as being part of those, warriors, they're able to then save the Shire. And so saving the Shire, it's a really cool conversation when Merry and Pippin are with the Ents, that whole part, like the whole concept of trying to, okay, I see there's a ton of problems in the world and it's really bad. I'm going to barricade myself and I'm going to try to hide, and that's ultimately what the Ents, now granted, the Ents have suffered a ton. They've been just totally, brutally ostracized or whatever, or killed and put out. And so they're trying to preserve themselves, right? It's a surviving mode, but they're like, this is not our war. Was the phrase.
Right. Yeah. Treebeard's always saying that.
And I think it's Mary, right? That says, but you live in this world, right? Meaning you can't just walk away from this. You're in this world. You can't avoid this. We're all in this war, this battle, and then Pippin says, well, let's just go back to the Shire, and then Mary's like, but there will be no Shire. The fires of Isengard are going to spread and there will be no Shire. And I think that's it's an awesome dialogue or conversation about how, we all are in this world and it's our world. And the decisions that we make can help or not the growth of our families, or the growth of the people around us, or our environments, especially in the area of the faith and the kingdom. Though we are part of this, regardless of whether we feel big or small, either an Ent or a Hobbit, we're a part of this world.
Right. And what you see in The Lord of the Rings, and this is something that Tolkien underscores again and again, subtly and brilliantly, is that it's the weak who confound the strong, we could say, just like St. Paul talks about in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, the first few chapters, and then 2 Corinthians. We hold this treasure in vessels of clay so that it's clear that the surpassing power is from God and not from us. But it's the weak ones who actually confound the strong. So it's the hobbits. Again, these kind of in the beginning, these fat, beer drinking, fun loving little people who are thrust into this. They're thrown into this situation that they didn't choose, that they don't want. And yet their decisions, apparently little decisions, end up having eternal consequences. There's that line too, actually, apropos of Treebeard and Fangorn there, where Tolkien talks about how the arrival of Merry and Pippin, it was like the falling of a tiny stone that started an avalanche. Yeah. So the stone was really small. It was Merry and Pippin, right? Right. But yet they were where they were supposed to be. Yeah. And they did what they were supposed to do. They made the choice that they were asked to make. And that was enough to serve as a catalyst then to actually get Treebeard and the Ents to destroy this great evil in Isengard. But it was just this tiny stone that starts the avalanche.
Yeah, and overcome their fear, right? Like you were talking about before. Yeah, and I think exactly to that, doesn't Galadriel, talking to Frodo, she says, even the smallest of creatures can change the course of history, right? Speaking exactly to what you're saying. Tolkien, again and again, is encouraging us, or seeing that and that's the way God's worked, right? I mean, look at all the characters in the Old Testament, especially, or even the New Testament with the Blessed Mother. I mean, she was just a simple girl, that God's power is able to shine through humble vessels. Yeah.
Actually, along those lines, in Introduction to Christianity, Cardinal Ratzinger, back then Father Ratzinger, he has this fascinating insight. He said that if you look at the planet Earth, he said, what is Earth in the cosmos? It's nothing. It's a speck. It's this tiny, tiny planet. Compare it to even the other planets in our solar system. It's pretty much a non-entity. And then he said, you keep drilling down. This is the place where God chose to reveal himself, Emmanuel, here on this planet. And then he said, you keep going to Israel. Ancient Israel, what was ancient Israel among the great nations of the earth compared to Egypt, to Assyria, to the Hittites, to the Babylonians, to the Persians? It's nothing. It's just this tiny, insignificant speck. Then what's Nazareth? Nazareth was this backwater within a backwater. It's nothing. And then Mary, just humble, apparently a non-entity, and yet she receives the presence of the Lord through the incarnation in her womb. And then the cross.
Yeah.
What's Jesus on the cross? I mean, apparent total failure.
Right.
And nothingness, and a crushed, defeated human being, apparently. And yet that's the redemption of the entire cosmos. And then the church.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the church, right? It's always in crisis since the Last Supper, right? And it's just so much weakness and sin, and yet this is the place of God's revelation. And then the Eucharist, the tiny host, which contains all the fullness of divinity.
Right, and like the simplest of foods, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great reflection or example of how God works and how He's worked and continues to work for us moving forward. I think just looking at our own selves, who we're definitely not, we try to be humble and try to be simple so that God can work through us. Well, Father John, time has flown by. I think that just indicates we got to keep doing more podcasts on Lord of the Rings.
I think that's an accurate interpretation.
Yeah. So thank you for your time today. This has been super enjoyable, just reflecting on our mutual love for Lord of the Rings. And I look forward to talking about this trilogy again soon.
Likewise. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
You have been listening to The Catholic Perspective, a resource from rcspirituality.org. Please visit our website and check out more great resources to help you pray, learn, grow, and go. Please join our team of digital missionaries by subscribing at rcspirituality.org.